Hello and welcome to video analyzing logo design throughout the Xenoblade series. Before we get started, no major spoilers for any of the games will be talked about in this video, and all footage and cutscenes shown will be from the first couple hours of each game. And also, I would like to mention that Luxin actually made a video on a similar topic to this about a year ago, but this video is going to go a bit more in detail over the evolution of all of the logos throughout the series, starting at the very beginning. Now before we get to the Xenoblade Chronicles logo that we're used to, we actually need to go back quite far to the original logo we had for Monado, Beginning of the World. This was the working title for Xenoblade Chronicles for the Wii. It's actually the title that stayed for a long time for a lot of people in America and Europe. Later the title would be changed to Xenoblade quite soon in Japan, but since there was no confirmation of a Western release, this is kind of the only name the West had for a while. Now the font choice here is a serif font, and serif means the little feet and little extrusions that come out of all of the different letters. Although this font is a particular type of serif because even some letters that normally aren't serifed in most serif fonts, such as the O, this font actually adds a couple little protrusions at the top and bottom, which makes this logo look very steampunk, which matches the start of Xenoblade 1 very well. Now the kerning between the letters is not great at all. I'm sure since this was mostly a temporary logo, it was done a bit in a rush, but the spacing between the N and the A compared to the A and the D looks very mismatched. When it comes to the color and texture, this is one of the only times that a logo of this series, instead of sporting a gray or silver color, is actually gold, which again worked well to give off the steampunk vibe of the original Xenoblade. And somehow we still have another logo to talk about before we get to the one we're familiar with, as this was the logo that was revealed in Japan when the name Xenoblade was actually announced. And this logo is quite different to the one we're used to. All of the letters are capitalized, and it continues to use that serif font that we talked about earlier. It uses a slightly different serif font that's a bit less bold and doesn't have those extra protrusions that the last one had. And it's also italicized a little bit. It's angled to the right, which is an aspect of the logos that will continue throughout the entire series. But this was actually the one to start that trend. Italicizing text for logo types or other logos usually helps add a lot of dynamics and movement to what would otherwise be a very static looking piece of text. Now, something that is interesting that actually lasts throughout the entire series is that while in the West the game was called Xenoblade Chronicles, in the East it was only called Xenoblade. And so beneath the logo is actually I think it's the katakana for Xenoblade, or how they would pronounce Xenoblade in Japan. And as I said, an alternative Japanese logo exists for every single Xenoblade game, and they all just say Xenoblade, and then below have the Xenoblade in katakana below. Now we're still not completely at the one we're used to yet. This is actually a rendition of the Xenoblade logo we're used to, where the top Xenoblade text is actually exactly what it would end up being, but instead of having Chronicles at the bottom, in that exact same font as the Xenoblade text, it instead is a very minimalist looking, thin Chronicles, which looks very clean, and I'm sure a lot of people in the community actually prefer this logo. But alas, the one we got is this one here, and so I will now get into the specifics of both this font, which would be the first time we saw it used, and the stylization of this particular Xenoblade logo. Now the font used here and used throughout the entire Xenoblade series starting from this point is just Helvetica Black, which is one of the boldest forms of a super popular font in graphic design called Helvetica. This font is what's known as a sans serif font, which means that those protrusions we saw earlier, which gave it the more old-timey look, are gone. And all the lines are super sharp and clean, and makes it look more futuristic and modern. Which is funny looking back, because the Xenoblade games are essentially a mix of more old-timey steampunk fantasy world-building and sci-fi and futuristic themes. So seeing the evolution from the first Monado Beginning of the World logo to this point is kind of seeing the transition that also happens within all the games. The letters here are also very close together. I'm a big fan of the kerning here, and there's very little spacing between all the letters, making the logo feel compact and like one solid entity. One of the most important things to talk about when you're talking about the Xenoblade logos is how each logo is actually stylized a bit to match a theme of its game. And the main style here is actually paint or ink splotches, which are seen everywhere over the logo. Not only does this style kind of break up the monotony of just a simple Helvetica, as it gives it a lot more dimension and shape with all the different splotches and splashes. It also gives the color of the logo a lot more texture, as without it the logo would just be a standard gradient from gray to white, where it gets more white in the middle and more gray on the outside. The paint texture and the almost crumpled paper texture everywhere throughout the logo. There's a lot of variety for color. As for what the paint splotches could symbolize, the one agreed upon theory is that it represents the kanji used to represent the different Monado arts that appear on the layers of glass in the Monado, as kanji was traditionally written using ink and brush. This creates a direct link between this logo and the Monado through those symbols, which is interesting. Personally, I think the splotches could also look like different small explosions, which could represent the battles or the wars that happened throughout the game between both the Bionis and the Mechonis, and Shulk and his friends against the Mechon. As we move on to Xenoblade Chronicles X, what's interesting is that we actually have a different logo to look at first, before we get to the one that was actually used in Xenoblade X. This is the one from the reveal trailer of the game, and it would never see the light of day again past that trailer, as the next one would already have the new logo with the blue X that we're familiar with. What's interesting here is that the Chronicles was shifted to the right quite a distance. Instead of being aligned under the X, it's now under the O, which they probably did so that the empty space created by the huge red X wouldn't be as jarring if they overlaid text on top of it. This is a trend that would continue throughout the entire series in Xenoblade X 2 and 3. This is just the first time the Chronicles text was shifted. Now, this text does give off temporary logo vibes, as there is no gradient, no texture, no stylization on the Xenoblade Chronicles text. It's just pure Helvetica. And additionally, the big red X doesn't match the vibe of Xenoblade X at all. The color scheme in Xenoblade X is very cold, with greens and blues and grays, so having a vibrant red X just doesn't match that. Additionally, the game is very sci-fi and futuristic, taking place on a whole different planet, so the more traditional kanji looking script doesn't make much sense at all here. Luckily though, we will get the finalized Xenoblade Chronicles X not long after, and this one matches the tone of the game way better in almost every way. First of all, the Chronicles X was actually shifted to the left a bit more, which I think is a lot nicer, as in the last one it was actually shifted a bit too far, which created a lot of empty space under the balance of both. We also see that there is a lot of texture on the Xenoblade Chronicles text. Arguably a bit too much, but it looks very rough and damaged, and there's a couple of things you could extract from this texture. One could represent scratched metal, as a lot of the robots and civilizations in this game are made out of metal. This could just represent them and the battles that they go through. As well, parts of the logo look shattered and broken, almost like glass, and there are what looks like to be bullets or bullet holes going through different parts of the logo, such as the X or the H and the B that have straight lines just shooting through them. Of course, this is a very futuristic Xenoblade game where guns and bullets are a very common weapon, so it makes sense to have them here as they're damaging the logo itself in many ways. Additionally, the X was changed to a light turquoise, light blue X that is a lot more interesting than the last one in regards to the theme of the game. This one is stylized to look like what I think is either a screen or LEDs or the glowy parts of the scales from the game. The X was actually cut into 3 different pieces, which is cool as it kind of reflects the damage of the bullets that went through the logo itself, but also it just looks very futuristic, and with the horizontal lines kind of alluding to the glowy futuristic style of the screens or the scales present around ULA. Xenoblade X was not the last game to have a temporary logo shown at its reveal. The last one to actually do that was Xenoblade Chronicles 2. This was the logo shown at the very end of the reveal trailer for this game, and it looks quite basic and unrefined compared to the other logos in the series. This is because the Xenoblade Chronicles X doesn't have any texture, but it also has the gradient, the gray to white vertical gradient on both the top text and the bottom text, which does not look great by itself. Additionally, the 2, while the font would stay the same between the reveal and the actual official logo, it did not have the cross that represents the Aegis inside the 2. But by the time of the game's release, it had a new logo, and this one is very stylized in a lot of cool ways. As I said before, this time we have the cross within the two of the logo to represent, the Aegis and their core crystal. But this time, the Xenoblade Chronicles text is on fire. It's all smoky, ashy, burnt. And there are just straight up flames around the X and other letters like the H or the A of the logo. Similarly to Xenoblade 1, the fire could represent a couple things. What's more probable is that it represents Pyra and her fire abilities, but it could also represent, but similarly to the first game, it could also represent the battles and wars that happened both in the game's past with Torna and within the game itself. Of course, Torna the Golden Country gets its own little additional logo, which is actually written in a serif font this time around, which is useful to represent both the old-timiness and the fact that this is a prequel, which takes place 500 years before the base game, so it's nice that it chooses a font that looks more old-timey instead of futuristic and modern. And of course we have the Torna symbol, or sigil, on the left there. Additionally, the shape of the box behind the Torna text is actually shaped like a diamond at the end, and this is just neat because it reflects all the different diamond-shaped elements of UI that are present throughout Xenoblade 2, of which there are a lot of. Now we've made it to Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. By itself, the Xenoblade Chronicles text did not change at all, but since this is a remake, it added another piece of text, which is Definitive Edition. This actually uses a different thickness of Helvetica, which is also italicized the same amount to reflect the Xenoblade Chronicles text. Now there are a couple things of note here. There are feathers present around the Definitive Edition text, which reflect most probably Future Connected, as that is Melia's side story in the game, or Melia's epilogue. As well, the Definitive Edition text is a bright red with a slight gradient which goes to a more pinky color in the middle. Red is just synonymous with the color of the whole Xenoblade 1, 2, 3 trilogy, so it makes sense that it would be reused here. Now something that I almost forgot about is that Future Connected actually got its own logo, which is this time in gold. And I think it's interesting that the side stories or epilogues such as Torna or Future Connected all seem to have this gold coloration to them. In Torna it was only the Torna part, but in this case it's the entire logo is this gold color. So maybe the approach they're going to go for in the future is that main story titles are in silver, and then the expansion titles for epilogues or prologues will be in gold. I guess we'll have to wait to see for Xenoblade 3 though. Now the actual stylization of this logo is very similar to the Definitive Edition logo. It's the same ink splotchy stylization on the Xenoblade text, and there's also feathers around the Future Connected text as well. The Future Connected text is actually super interesting to me for a couple reasons. It's designed in a super interesting way because it's a gradient from a very serif font to a very sans serif font. Like we're going from the past to the future, which is just really cool and works really well with the theme of this expansion and what it meant for the future of the series. And finally, we have arrived to the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 logo. And the stylization equivalent this time around are the motes of light, which are coming out from the different letters. Now in the game, the motes of light are actually what appear when Noah and Mio play the Ossian melody around dead bodies and husks throughout the story. They're synonymous with death and moving on and laying to rest what has fallen, which perfectly encapsulates the themes and story of the game brilliantly. So it would make sense that they would be used here in the logo. Since these motes only appear when someone's dead or when their time is running out, it's almost like it's dissolving, or the logo itself is like starting to fade away. When it comes to texture, this one's actually pretty simple. It just has a light layer of noise around the bottom of each letter. This is just to add a bit more texture and make it look more interesting than if the entire logo was plain white. And the 3 of the logo actually has a mark that each of the characters have, which represents how much time they have left alive, which is synonymous with the theme of time running out throughout the entire game. And that's all of the logos for the entire series. I think it's really interesting to see the evolution of different stylistic choices and different themes used throughout the different games. And I think it's a really cool tradition that each game has its own different spins and takes on the Xenoblade Chronicles text itself. Now, I was originally also going to talk about box art in this video, but I think it's running a bit long, so I might make a separate video on that, as I do think there could be quite a lot to say on each of the separate box arts. Also, side note, with the release of Persona 5 on Switch coming soon, since Persona 5 is a very appealing looking game to a graphic designer, I'm thinking of playing it on launch day over at my Twitch channel, which I'll have in the description if you're interested. So if you want to see a graphic designer's blind playthrough of Persona 5, which is one of the coolest looking graphic design styles I've seen of any game, then yeah, feel free. I should be live around 8 PM UK time most evenings once it comes out. Yeah, that's about it. Thanks for watching. Take it easy.